Here with another classic today, Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. This is the last of the 6 Jane Austen novels that I had left to read. It probably was a span of almost 10 years that I took to read all the books. First, I read Pride and Prejudice, definitely a good starting point that I'd recommend. That was maybe about 8 years ago. Then Emma, 5 years ago, and Persuasion and Northanger Abbey not long after Emma. Then Sense and Sensibility most recently, a year or two ago, and finally Mansfield Park. It took me a while to get to this last one, and I think probably part of it is because I've loved all these books so much that I wanted to have one left to read still. But one of my friends started reading this recently. I saw there was a podcast series coming out on the Close Reads podcast, which focused on this novel. Jennifer Jelinkova on her channel released a nice hour-long video covering all the Jane Austen novels individually, which I watched and which was great, but for the time being, I had to just skip over Mansfield Park section. Basically, there were a lot of things that finally came together to make this a good time to finally read Mansfield Park. Now, I knew going into it that it was one of the longer Austen novels, and while well regarded, obviously not as famous as some of the others. In the past, I've listened to some of the other Jane Austen novels. I think it's been about half and half listening versus reading the text. For this one, I just wanted to read it in text form, which is what I did. And once I finally got going, it took me only probably about 2 weeks to finish it, making some time in the evening and morning, maybe about an hour a day here and there. And it was a fast read, just like with all of Jane Austen's novels for me. The language is maybe a little bit tough if you're not familiar with this style of British writing, but it's very witty and there's interesting drama happening throughout the novel. Lots of characters who are fun to get to know, and you never really know exactly what's going to happen next, even if you can kind of guess where it's all going towards at the end. Classic Jane Austen for sure. And all that while also being different. Maybe not very different from her other novels. I mean, it's still Jane Austen, but different in enough ways that it certainly doesn't feel like I'm just reading, a slightly different version of one of her other novels. In spite of the commonalities, Mansfield Park has its own world and set of characters. In Mansfield Park, maybe more than in some of Austen's other novels, there is this look into what it means to be moral or right thinking. Obviously, there are other Jane Austen novels that look into different faults and foibles of humans, and particularly of women and men, but women protagonists, trying to grow up and become the women that society asks them to become. But also at the same time, women who can be happy and can thrive in the world that they live in. And in Fanny Price, we certainly have some of that, but we can see that it's not just being a woman whom society can admire and respect and acts rightly in social situations simply in terms of appearances. It also is being someone who thinks morally and who has a strong moral sense. Throughout the novel, we see Fanny cultivating this moral sense and facing dilemmas where there is not a clear right decision of what to do. For example, there are quite a few passages where Fanny catches herself having less than charitable thoughts about others around her, thoughts which are still often very fair to the person she's thinking about. We see her struggling to correct herself, sometimes to overcorrect herself, when she views herself to not be acting or even thinking as the woman who she believes she should be. Much of this moral sense, of course, is a reflection of one of the love interests and often role models in the novel, her cousin Edmund, who is going to become a clergyman. There's plenty of discussion in this novel of how a lot of the time people view this being a clergyman as sort of a duty that they have to do, but they don't take it with the utmost seriousness. But in Edmund, he views this as a big responsibility and really as a true vocation in his life to be a shepherd of his people in matters of faith, but also not just faith in a strictly liturgical sense, but also in, making relationships with the people of his parish and guiding them to become better human beings. Something he first models in his relationship with his cousin Fanny from a young age, especially for her. That all makes the relationship a little bit interesting and unusual too in this book. I mean, part of why the two of them admire each other's character comes from the fact that Fanny, she certainly had a personality and everything before she came to Mansfield Park to live with her cousins and her aunt and uncle, but she was still very young at the time. And her sense of morals and decorum and propriety as a young adult were all derived from her experience at Mansfield Park. And in particular, her moral sense was impressed upon her or developed through her interactions with her cousin Edmund, who was one of the only real role models in this regard. I'll just give a heads up before I proceed any further that I will be talking about spoilers for the novel in this book. If you haven't read it already, I'd encourage you to just go and check it out yourself and then come back and tell me what you think. But feel free to stick with it if you don't care. But I'm going to get into spoilers now. Now, this exploration of what it means to be moral and virtuous, even when others are not watching, comes up often in the book, and it becomes particularly apparent with Edmund's other love interest. The inimitable Mary Crawford is a woman who appears and knows how to act in a way that makes her very attractive to Edmund, although she often conceals her more cynical side while she's around Edmund. Fanny, though, is quick to see Mary Crawford for who she is, and, well, Edmund is also quick to see, but his judgment becomes clouded over before too long. And only at the end of the book does it become once again apparent to him just how morally bankrupt this woman is. I don't think that's too harsh to say of her. She knows how to act properly, but it's clear that the two of them, Edmund and Mary, have so little in common in terms of how they view their role as a person living in this world and this society, which is evident to Fanny early on by the way that Mary Crawford talks disdainfully about the profession of being a clergyman and tries to talk Edmund out of this decision to become one, not to mention how she talks about others in general and how little she seems to regard others' feelings at times. I'm quite curious, though, how other readers nowadays view the characters in this book. Fanny Price as a protagonist is unique and, for me, very memorable, definitely different and distinguishable from any of Jane Austen's other protagonists. In the Close Reads podcast, they referred to her as a boring protagonist, and therefore a risky protagonist, the one that really works out. And while I see what they mean, I don't think I ever found Fanny boring as a character. Maybe boring in the sense of how she may appear to other characters, which is why she's unique as a protagonist. Because with some of Austen's other protagonists, like Emma or Elizabeth Bennet, we do see a lot of that personality right on the surface in the way they interact with other characters. While Fanny is more of a passive, timid, but good-hearted young girl, one who's often overlooked but who always is around as an astute observer of the social situations around her. Which is why I always liked her, and I feel that many readers will like her too, because aren't many of us like that, at least at times? I actually found myself inhabiting Fanny's emotional world more often than I did for at least some of the other Jane Austen protagonists. It's also a bit tricky for me to tell how much of this reserved demeanor is just how Fanny is and always has been, versus how much of it is because of this experience as a young girl, where she had to leave her birth family and where she's raised as the grudgingly accepted and still somewhat loved cousin, the charity case of a sort in a household of her wealthier aunt and uncle. Whether directly because of that or not, we certainly don't get a strong-willed character like a Marianne Dashwood or Emma Woodhouse or Elizabeth Bennet. Those characters, while they all differ from one another in many ways, are more the authors of their own stories, whereas Fanny is not always the author of her own story, and that's one of the things about this novel that is really interesting. Fanny, in contrast with Elizabeth Bennet, whose hasty judgments of other people come to work against her, Fanny is someone who actually sees others quite clearly but is so doubtful of her own judgments at times. Of course, part of reading Jane Austen is seeing how women are never fully the authors of their story, and they're forced to comply with a lot of societal expectations, including many that were uniquely placed on them in this very specific society of Jane Austen's times, and others that persist to this day. In Mansfield Park, we get a compelling portrayal of some of the frustrating and really impossible dilemmas that women like Fanny find themselves confronted with. For example, later in the book, we have a bit of a philanderer character, Henry Crawford, who starts paying attention to Fanny and making romantic overtures. Fanny is very clearly, to the reader, not interested because she's seen him really not long ago at all, hitting on her cousins, including one who is engaged to be married shortly, and playing with their emotions for his own fun and vanity without any regard for them. So not only does she doubt his sincerity in his attentions to her, she also just dislikes this aspect of his character regardless. But Fanny is unable to convince him or anyone else that she's not interested in him. As she keeps denying him, she acts seemingly properly in every occasion by politely refusing him, saying that she'll never fall in love with him, that they're too dissimilar. And this predicament that we see here is one that also comes up in a similar scenario in Pride and Prejudice, but that one doesn't go on for quite as long. The issue is the way that the women are expected to behave if they actually have no feelings of regard for the man who's proposing to them is exactly the same as how people seem to think that they would behave if they actually did have great regard for the man and wish to marry him after all and are just being modest. You know, they're not supposed to really betray strong feelings, and they're just supposed to be politely deferential. And the more that she says, I'm really not interested, I do not like this, the more that he persists. And I mean, this is, I think, something that maybe doesn't exist in the exact same way nowadays, but certainly we see dynamics like this all the time. So it certainly is a lesson that men and women, but men in particular nowadays, I think have to learn when they're forming relationships or trying to form relationships. So it's certainly a very interesting and very frustrating part of the story, but powerfully portrayed here. Another societal or moral expectation that is really constraining for Fanny here is the way in which it's not good for a woman to express ill opinions of others, except in a very subtle way or in a hinting way. Maybe just confirming if others express their own conclusions, which are accurate and negative. For example, she has many reasons not to like Miss Crawford. Now, you could argue that part of why she doesn't express this fully is because she's a little meek or a little passive. She's not secure or confident in expressing those opinions, but she does have a very strong intuitive sense of these opinions, even if she somewhat doubts them herself. She's certainly confident in her negative opinion of Mr. Crawford for at least 90% of the time in this book, or else she wouldn't have so persistently refused him, even when her family is all suggesting her to do otherwise. But there are so many places in this book, in particular when Fanny's interacting with Miss Crawford, where you really want Fanny to just tell Edmund, look, this is what kind of a person she is. There's this and this and this, but she doesn't do it. Partly because she's too shy, partly because she's convinced that Edmund wouldn't see it anyway, and maybe he wouldn't, partly because she believes a little bit that her judgment is compromised by her own feelings for Edmund. She's still confident that Miss Crawford is not an appropriate match for Edmund, but she has a hard time viewing herself as impartial in this situation. It is somewhat admirable, but it's also quite frustrating throughout how she governs her behavior to essentially make the right decisions for herself, but let those around her be the victims of their own bad decisions, even if she could potentially help them. Not that she's unwilling to hazard an opinion here or there, but when the recipient isn't immediately going to agree with her opinion, she just respects that and lets it be. And one other challenge that Fanny faces that is really intriguing late in the novel is when Fanny sort of comes to realize that Henry Crawford, in spite of his flaws, is actually not trifling with her. He actually seems to genuinely admire her in a way that is unlike his attentions to her cousins. Of course, the very thing that makes her the most admirable to him is paradoxically the fact that she sees right through his superficial charms and straight into his dubious underlying quality of character, and therefore he's never going to win her over. But when he starts seemingly changing his behavior and all of her family begins to convey to her that, you only have so many marriage proposals and maybe such a match would be convenient for her, even if not a perfect match. I myself, I knew how it all must end up in the end, so I wasn't left in total suspense here, but there was this clear feeling I had of, wow, this is really a dilemma, because I can't see her actually happily accepting this marriage proposal, but as we often see in these Jane Austen novels, there are women who agree to a marriage that is advantageous to them in other ways, even if they're not really in love with the person they're marrying. Not that Fanny's cousin Maria Bertram is any paragon of virtue, but her marriage with Mr. Rushwood, a really dull man, who has a good fortune and a good estate, and 42 lines in the play, everyone in the family pretty much acknowledges early on, we know what this marriage is for, and we approve of it as such, even if we won't come right out and say it like that. Thinking about this novel as a whole, like all of Jane Austen's novels, I really enjoyed this work throughout. I finished it quickly because you just keep wanting to know what happens next and enjoying the whole process of it. If I had to compare this personally with all of Jane Austen's other novels, now that I've read all 6, in terms of how much I enjoyed them, if I'm going to be honest, I think I might place it on the bottom. And that's not a slight to this novel at all, because I think this is a really good novel and I don't have much negative to say about it at all. I guess the thing about Mansfield Park, though, is that while the character drama at the center of it is as interesting as ever, and therefore it kept me captivated the whole way through, it's not quite as sensational or flashy. There's a bit less action than in a novel like Pride and Prejudice, where you have all these sisters of the family with, rich bachelors coming into town to hold balls every fortnight. There's more of an experience in these other novels of the society and the broader world around them, whereas Mansfield Park is much more parochial. There's a reason this novel's title is the name of the place. It really is contained mostly in the estate of Mansfield Park, for at least 80% of the novel. And the time not spent at Mansfield Park, whether by Fanny in Portsmouth or the other characters who go off to London or wherever else, is often spent wishing themselves back at Mansfield Park. This also, though, means that in Mansfield Park, you really get to know these characters and the guests who visit them in Mansfield Park very well. There's a deep level of attention paid to many characters in this novel. How would I rank all the Jane Austen novels now after reading them all? Well, that probably needs to be a different video, and honestly, I feel like I'd probably need to revisit Persuasion before making the final call on where that one would rank. But yeah, as much as I like this one, I think maybe it says something about modernity and our craving for action and excitement that this one isn't up there on top for me. We might all, unfortunately, be a bit more like Mary Crawford these days than we'd like to admit. I mean, I don't think this would have been Mary Crawford's favorite Jane Austen novel either, even if maybe deep down she should have recognized its value, as she always claimed to find herself longing to be back at Mansfield Park whenever she found herself out partying with her no-good London friends. I think one other thing I'll add as I'm reviewing this experience of Mansfield Park is that having now read all the Jane Austen novels, it's interesting because I've certainly changed as a person and as a reader since I read my first Jane Austen novel, Pride and Prejudice, which at the time I still found super exciting and enjoyable and supremely well written. But there were definitely parts of it that were kind of puzzling to me or I didn't perceive in the same way that I do now. Not that the way I perceive them now is correct or even better, but I've had more time to think about what it is that Jane Austen is generally trying to accomplish in these novels. The way that she presents her characters, what novels were like at the time. I've had chances to discuss these novels with other people and watch a lot of YouTube videos and listen to good podcast series about them. At this point, I actually would really even like to read some actual books about Jane Austen's works to learn more of that context behind them beyond just what I've gathered from the books and from some basic learnings. But as I understand it, the novel as it existed in Jane Austen's time was quite a different form than the novels that we have today, and this can be hard to fit into our conception of what a novel should be. I certainly had a similar experience when reading Jane Eyre and when reading War and Peace. They eluded my expectations in ways that maybe seemed like it made them worse if applying modern standards than more modern novels, but also I really want to let these novels stand as they were meant to be at the time instead of taking the modern standard as the norm. But for example, when discussing Sense and Sensibility a few months ago with Davood Gozli's reading group, which is a really great discussion, there were a wide variety of reactions to that book, and I saw that a lot of people in the group found Sense and Sensibility challenging or frustrating for sorts of reasons that I think are related to this. For one, some of the characters, particularly the side characters, and even in some moments the more central ones, they come across a bit as these one-note caricatures. And yeah, I would definitely argue that there's at least some sense of caricature or oversimplification to almost every one of her characters. They tend to fit a type, to be more easily characterized by simple description than an actual human being. Of course, sometimes there are shifts in this. You learn something about them later that reveals they're not actually quite like what they seem to be. But even for those characters, it's often like, okay, at first they fit one mold and then you learn something else and then there's two different parts to them. Or, you thought they were in this mold, but actually they're more in this other mold. And maybe part of that comes from this notion that many novels of the time were, among other things, meant to educate readers on morals and propriety. I really don't know to what extent that was the goal of Jane Austen's works versus, at times, to critique the morals that others in society advocated for young women to adopt. But this aspect is part of what I like about reading Jane Austen. I mean, without reading more about her goals with her novels, just taking my own impressions of her work and those I formed from some discussions, it often feels there's quite a deep and pointed critique of a lot of the ways that women are expected to behave in society, and a lot of critique of societal values in general. Yet at the same time, I'm also a little bit more open now to the notion that maybe there is an element of instructive moral education and setting role models in these novels. In Sense and Sensibility, is Eleanor exemplifying what a good woman should be in her actions towards others in the world around her? Or is Sense and Sensibility actually a subtle critique of the fact that we live in a society where women have to behave more like Eleanor, even when it often comes at cost to them? I don't know, maybe it's a little bit of both, but at least as I read it nowadays, I do still read it more as a critique, like a lamentation of the fact that Marianne's way of viewing the world has a certain beauty and innocence to it, and yet it is objectively not the correct way to play the game of life in the society that Jane Austen lives in. And then one other aspect of Austen's novels that I think I've never known exactly what to make of it, and certainly some people found it understandably jarring in Davood's reading group, is with Austen's novels, they're kind of they don't have much of a resolution. They just end. In the last few chapters, that's when the hero and the heroine get together and they live happily ever after, and You kind of just have to take the author's word for it. In some of the novels, like Emma, I'm not even sure if we can take the author's word for it. I'm not 100% convinced that the author wants us to take her word for it. I'm fine, though, to just let that be ambiguous at this point myself, and I'm fine with this notion that these novels by Jane Austen are not going for complete realism. In fact, I'm glad they're not, so in that way I appreciate this older form of the novel. Her works are very real in the way that they highlight and play with human flaws and strengths and peculiarities. But considering all of this, it's been a great time reading Austen's novels, and I don't think this is the last that I'll be reading of them. It does feel satisfying and exciting to have completed an author's main body of work in this way. I know that she had some other stuff that she wrote as well, but in terms of her full-length novels, I made it through, and I find that really gratifying. And I'm grateful to you as well for watching, so thanks for sticking around, and happy reading.